Hello, everyone. I just wanted to kind of dive into the subject matter about this channel is mostly going to be about. So today I wanted to attack one of the fundamental presuppositions of the atheist core beliefs. And one of the things I object to is the way burden of proof is discussed or conceptualized. So I think it's a misunderstanding, and it's especially common among atheists, go figure. So what I'd like to do is kind of lay out how I've seen this unfold, and I've been talking about this for a long time. Um, many people don't seem to understand the burden of proof. It's it's something that has especially plagued the God debate. Does God exist? For ever since it began, and people can't seem to wrap their head around how the question of whether God exists should be conceptualized as far as requiring evidence. So I wrote a little passage here, more like an essay. It's like a 2-page essay, because I wanted to get my thoughts straight on this before I just jumped into trying to dispute this claim by atheists, which is what I believe to be the new defense of atheism, which is that it's a lack of belief rather than a positive belief of a lack of God. So there's something really sneaky about that line, a lack of belief, that phrase. It's not very straightforward. So I want to try to unpack that a little bit. So I'm going to try to read this passage first, and maybe add in my original thoughts on it, if you will, because I wrote this all myself. But perhaps my more temporal realizations on where I think my thoughts are going on this. But I think it makes a pretty good case against the atheist conceptualization of the burden of proof, which I've found to be very erroneous. So here it goes. The burden of proof is an oft misunderstood concept. People think that those making a positive claim of something being real or existing is what defines burden of proof. But it can also be the other way around, in which making the positive claim for the non-existence of something requires proof. Okay, so we discussed that, and that seems to be something that people generally accept now. It's not largely debated. Whereas, I remember 8 years ago, maybe, when I was I would say it was about 3 or 4 years after I began discussing this, but I noticed people using that a lot, and they would claim that, and people, and well, the point is, since then, people have begun to realize that that's not a valid argument against God, which is, you need proof, we don't. So they've tried to blur the lines rather than, making it this binary binary idea. Either you believe in God or you believe in a lack of God. So, and there's always the agnostics, which is the other subject I'm going to get into. So, okay, it's not a simple matter, and it rarely falls to only one side of an ideological debate between two mutually exclusive ideas. In this case, the belief in God is a positive claim, but so is the belief in the non-existence of God. Many atheists understand this very well, but there are the honest types who simply misunderstand the concepts, and then there are those who, either consciously or subconsciously, do whatever mental gymnastics they need to do in order to maintain the validity of their ideological framework. For instance, the lack of belief is a popular moniker for new atheism, in which the atheist pretends not to believe in the lack of God, but to lack a belief in God because no evidence has sufficiently proven his existence. So this attitude is deeply flawed for several reasons, some of which I will state here and thoroughly refute. When an ideology is threatened, there is no excuse for not being open to the idea that your position could be challenged, but that is often the case. Atheists sit back and judge the beliefs of others while acting like their supposed lack of a stance gives them the ability to sit on their high horse and judge the arguments of others as either convincing or unconvincing. So this is one thing, and I've finished the first paragraph of what I've written here. This is the thing that I kind of began to realize as I was writing this piece here. Because as we know, writing is a more advanced form of thinking, and I was able to think through just how it is that this conceptualization of the burden of proof could be wrong, which is that the lack of belief that atheists claim is actually still a position. It is not a lack of a position, as I will go on to show. So then when they start to say it is a lack of a position, it starts to become confused with agnosticism, which simply states that there is a lack of knowledge there, rather than a lack of belief, which is actually the lack of belief is actually a statement. It is not simply an observation. It's a statement about what the person who makes the statement, it's a stance. It's a statement about what the person who makes the statement intends to believe, which is nothing. They intend to remain ignorant. Okay, so I'll go on to unpack this even more. First of all, nobody is above reproach on this matter. If you are sitting idly by, evaluating the belief systems of others, it begs the question of from whence do you derive the wisdom or wherewithal to judge the beliefs of others? Does almighty science tell you whose beliefs are the most logical to believe? Okay, because see, this is probably even another subject, but science cannot verify these claims. It cannot say whose beliefs about something that is not scientific is correct. And by the way, not all matters can be proven empirically. Not all matters, well, that's just obvious, but I mean, not all matters that are true have anything to do with empiricism. So there is valid thinking to be done outside of the parameters of science. For instance, can you do a scientific experiment to justify the validity of science itself? Can science verify itself, its own axiomatic presuppositions? Well, the answer, it would seem to me, is no. But you can think for yourself. What criteria do you use? This is immaterial to the main point. But if you are not working to defend some kind of position on this matter, it simply shows that you do not care enough to find the truth. So this is where I kind of began to realize just what atheists are up to. And it's not Pascal's wager. It's not saying you should believe or else because hey, what could go wrong? The idea is if this is really, whether or not this is true is a very important question, and you know that because you act like it. This is why we spend so much time debating this question. Does God exist? Okay, and if you're not working toward some kind of knowledgeable position on this matter, it just means you don't care enough. if you are working to stay where you are, to lack a belief, to lack positive knowledge, then you're working against the purpose of life, I would say, which is to find the answer to this question. Because it's a very important question. Wouldn't you want to know if God existed? Or would you want to know if God didn't exist? I would say either way, it would be a pretty important thing to find out. So moving toward being informed on this matter is a very positive position, or a very positive progression. All right, so let's continue. As one grows older, the hope is not that they would simply be entrenched in their non-belief their entire lives, because that does not add value to the discussion in which we try to progress towards the ultimate truth. Yes, as a human species there. Although, you know, the word species, whatever, it's not well defined. There is no I said mutual position, that's not right. There is no neutral position. Oh my. Okay. There is no I wrote this in like 5 minutes. There is no neutral position in this debate. Find an explanation and defend it. Make a positive claim about the origin of the universe. Don't defend non-beliefs. Okay, so that's a problem that I've heard brought up before by other YouTubers, like the distributist, shout out, or the concept of non-belief in general. It is not productive and does not reflect any progress toward the truth or reveal any regression away from it. It simply absolves the responsibility one has to engage in meaningful dialogue on the subject. Okay, so if you engage in this subject, you could go either way. You could either regress from the truth or you can move toward it. But either way, that would entail some responsibility. And you would have to be responsible for the directional movement that you have on the matter. But if you defend a non-belief, then you don't have to do anything. You just have to sit there and judge. And that's pretty nice from an atheist perspective. So that's why they take up this position. That's why they say, oh, this is my position. I lack something. I don't have anything. Easy. I mean, it's easy to say that because then there's nothing to defend. Secondly, when one uses the now cliched lack of belief as a justification for their position, they are usually attempting to side with those making a positive claim in the lack of belief, in the lack of a God, by claiming they are simply unconvinced by the positive arguments for God, but simply make no arguments to the contrary. Why is it then that the atheist who uses this phrase almost never questions or interrogates the claims of the hard atheist? And I use that word because apparently atheists, not all atheists are hard atheists, but it would seem there should be some distinction there. You know, I'm just talking about the semantics here. They say they lack a belief, and yet people who lack in the positive, who have a positive belief in the non-existence of God, are also called atheists. So it would seem there has been some rehashing of the terms here. Okay, so anyway, where was I? So they claim, okay, so they attempt to side with those claiming they are simply unconvinced by the positive arguments for God, but they make no arguments to the contrary. Why is it then that atheists who use this phrase almost never question or interrogates the claims of the hard atheist making a claim for the non-existence of God? Why is it that we see so many atheists using this against the believers, but not against the unbelievers? Not the unbelievers, but they never use this against the hard atheists, you know, for lack of a better term. Why is it that they are only skeptical toward belief, but not unbelief? As I've shown, both positions need evidence to be justified. And this is not just something I've shown. This should be common knowledge. And I've been saying this for a long time. If atheism is not a positive claim, then why is it that we are so invested in refuting the positive claims of believers? Okay, they, not we, atheists. Sorry, I wrote this down wrong. Then why is it that they are so invested in refuting the positive claims of believers while ignoring positive disbelief? The lack of belief, rather, seems to be a way to absolve responsibility while justifying their living as if God does not exist, which is not a tenable state in which to exist because the action belies the belief, and the belief is indefensible. Even if positive belief in God is also indefensible, the maintenance of a lack of belief is not an option. Because, as I've kind of said before, there's a difference between a lack of belief and a lack of knowledge. A lack of knowledge is simply admitting immaturity on the part of the speaker. A lack of belief is a claim that says, I'm staying here, I'm not moving. Okay, lastly, the term atheism is totally different from agnosticism, and while some atheists claim it is simply a statement of the lack of belief, whereas agnosticism pertains more to knowledge than belief, which it does, a lack of knowledge precludes any belief either way. Whereas an atheist would say their lack of belief only pertains to their lack of belief in God without also pertaining to their lack of belief in no God, the lack of knowledge or agnosticism leaves open both possibilities without singling out the lack of subscription to a particular side of the debate. For instance, if a man you'd never seen before, okay, so I'm going to jump into my little analogy here. For instance, if a man you'd never seen before in your life walked up to you on the street and asked you if you believed he had a nickel in his pocket, you wouldn't say you lacked the belief that he has a nickel in his pocket, would you? Because that signals out the positive belief. Okay, he asked the question, do you have a positive belief that I do not have, that I have a nickel in my pocket? But you don't respond with that. You don't say, well, yeah, I lack that. Well, no, I lack that belief. You say, I don't know. More likely, you would say, I don't know, because you want to treat both possibilities as equally likely, even if he doesn't, which you should do with an absolute lack of knowledge. It therefore follows that agnosticism is at least a reasonable stance to hold. So, when I say agnosticism, I'm defining it as the admission of a complete lack of knowledge without any preference for belief. And that's the thing. There is an obvious preference here when it comes to atheists. It therefore follows that agnosticism is at least a reasonable stance to hold, whereas atheism, or the lack of belief in a particular worldview, and notice particular as in on one side of the binary, either a belief in God or a belief in no God. Either there is God or there isn't. Okay? So if you say that you lack a belief in one side, okay, so what does that exactly say? Does that really treat each side equally? Does it really make sense to think that one side deserves more scrutiny than the other? If so, how can you say then that the burden of proof, how can you then say that a positive disbelief in God is also indefensible, or there is no evidence for it. How can you then say that if you are then preferring or leaning toward that position if you lack absolutely all knowledge on the subject? Which should be your starting point. I lack all knowledge on this. Neither one is more likely. So that still requires some justification if you're going to say that. If you're going to say that I lack a belief in a positive view, but I do not lack a belief in the positive disbelief or negative belief view. Just as the positive claim the non-existence of God would also require that justification. Okay, so in summary, the lack of belief moniker doesn't give one sufficient reason to judge the beliefs of and cast aspersions on believers. Atheism, too, is a position of faith, and saying that one lacks a belief in God doesn't make this lack of belief somehow more of a neutral position with less belief entailing it, from which atheists can choose to denigrate believers for their faith. The use of the term is merely an evolved form of atheism, which, since it was discovered that a positive belief in the lack of God also requires faith, since you would have to know everything to make such a claim. Changing the language may change the perception of the position and make it harder to pin down what atheists actually stand for, but the ruse is always uncovered, and atheists will soon have to find new ground from which to cast their aspersions on the rest of humanity for its silly faith. The only neutral position is a lack of knowledge, not a lack of belief. Since a lack of knowledge is simply an admission of immaturity or learnedness, but a lack of belief makes a statement, that statement being that the possessor of said beliefs or said unbeliefs has chosen not to move toward knowledge but to remain ignorant under the guise of intellectual skepticism. Okay, so this is kind of the crux of what I wanted to get to on this channel, which is, I started by talking more about education, and I have some of my teaching videos up there. I'm still pretty passionate about that, although I do question sometimes whether it's what I want to do for the rest of my life, but, I took it seriously, so that's the thing. I like to talk about it, and I have a lot of knowledge on these subjects. But this is something I have not brought to the light very often, or I have not discussed it very often, basically only when I got the chance, and the chance rarely arises because this doesn't just come up. So I wanted to address this what I see as this sort of problematic view, this misconception of what the burden of proof actually is. Okay, it's not saying you believe in God, therefore you have to prove it. It's saying if you make the claim that you believe in something, or that you are saying something is true, then you must verify that. Okay, so don't get caught up on the idea that, the belief in God is positive and the belief in a lack of God is negative because it is the belief in the lack of something rather than the belief in something. Don't be thinking that somehow skews the debate toward the atheist side, like it's an uphill battle to prove that God exists. It's not. The playing field is level already because we're all starting from the same basic presuppositions, which is that we do not know what transcends our reality. We can find some indication and some, we can find evidence of it. It's not going to be It's not going to be scientific evidence, but evidence nonetheless. You know, I know that's a very strange concept for most atheists, most new atheists out there today, but science is not all there is, and it's far more fundamental than that. So anyway, thanks for watching this video. I just wanted to start talking about the things that that I believe really matter, and the misconceptions that I think need to be cleared up. What I want to do is move this channel toward more of a discussion on these types of topics, and I would like to move on to other things like evolution, creation, what else? The Bible. I need to study more on the Bible, but I do have an idea of what the Bible is. And I want to reiterate, I'm coming at this from a sort of philosophical perspective, not one of a hardcore believer or someone who has already become ideologically possessed, which is another thing I want to talk about, which is the ideological possession of atheists, which I think is something that is too not often talked about enough. Because, you know, it is often the case that people will talk about the ideological possession of leftists or communists, for example. But I see this a lot in atheists too, and I don't think it's being talked about enough. So that's what I would like to move toward. And eventually, hopefully, toward the Bible and toward Revelations. This is also one thing that I think is very complicated. It's not meaningless because it's complicated. Revelations is a very meaningful text, and it's not the babble of some, you know, drug-addled ape, for lack of a better term. Or, you know, maybe that's the correct term, but that's not what it is, okay? Revelation is a very meaningful text, and I believe it points toward the salvation of all humanity rather than merely the salvation of some. But that is something I'll get into later, and you may have questions on it, which you are free to ask. So if you have some feedback on this topic, and the topic of this video is the burden of proof when it comes to the debate of whether God exists. So please leave that feedback in the comments or on my channel, and please subscribe, like this video. Thank you very much.